Yeah. The four sites we went to visit were the Legacy Museum, the Rosa Parks Museum, the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, which was where Martin Luther King was a pastor during the 1955 bus boycott, and the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. Montgomery was really transformed by Bryan Stevenson, who came down in the late 1980s. He was a Harvard-trained lawyer, and he has spent his whole career helping disenfranchised people who had lack of access to legal representation. Alabama itself has one of the highest rates of incarceration for African Americans in the nation, and they provide no legal representation to people. There was no public defender system there. So you have dozens and dozens of black people who were on death row that Bryan Stevenson was able to help seek justice. And he's become absolutely legendary. There was a movie just made about him about a year and a half ago called Just Mercy, based on the book that he wrote, which describes the Walter McMillan case, which is just one example of an African-American man who was just railroaded through the justice system. And he was able to help him finally be exonerated and free from death row. So the lower right image there is kind of an important photograph that shows jars from just a handful of the sites around the United States where racial terror lynching has occurred. And each one of those jars represents a site and soil that was collected from that site and is put in display. It's one of the very powerful things you'll experience when you go to visit the Legacy Museum. For me, one of the most deeply personal and moving parts of the trip was the first morning in Montgomery when we went to the Legacy Museum. And we walked through the door, and the very first exhibit that we encountered there was about the whole story that has to be told in order for slavery to exist. That a myth had to be created, that there is a difference, that is a racial difference, and that somehow white people are superior to black people, and that it was therefore okay to enslave them and own them and trade them as property. A myth that has perpetuated beyond slavery and continued in just different forms to the present day. Now, it's not that I didn't know this when I went to Montgomery. It's not that I didn't know about slavery. It's not that I didn't know that some of the basic facts of this. It was, I think, it's one thing to know something, and it's another to kind of feel it in the marrow of your bones. And I have to say that that moment for me, standing in Slave Warehouse, which is where the Legacy Museum is today, and being with an interracial group of people that I'm becoming friends with, made this impact me in a deep, deep emotional way. The truth of it was somehow able to access me at a far deeper level. And that was just the beginning. That was the first morning of the trip, in the first room. And I knew something was happening within me emotionally. And it was truly important. And everybody can describe their experience themselves, and you're going to hear 5 different stories here tonight about going to Montgomery. But that was one of the most powerful moments for me. Just to reiterate, and you can read this for yourself, but slavery just did not end. Slavery just took on new forms. and the oppression, the belief in white supremacy, just transmuted and transformed itself throughout the years after the Civil War, and continued consistently to the present day, whether it was through the things that you know, such as the Jim Crow era and segregation, mass incarceration. It just continued and still continues. This is a quote from my wife, which I'll share with you. I came away from Montgomery shocked at how the history I had been taught at school, culture, and my personal life was not only incomplete but inaccurate. Nothing had ever made me reflect upon the true depth of cruelty and harshness of what African Americans experienced in this country. My education had been whitewashed. I came away feeling the need to relearn history and with a greater responsibility to end racism and bring about changes that produce true justice. And that's by Lauren Bondi, a white female. And I will say that it was a universal statement. Almost everybody that came away from the trip had this same experience of, geez, I just did not learn my history. I did not learn anywhere near the depth of the history. So that was an important thing that we all took away with us. I should have said this is a very disturbing slide, but this is very much the truth of the legacy of terrorism. We spent a great deal of time examining racial terror lynching while we were in Montgomery, and the sad fact is that the George Floyd murder, which is just one of many, many extrajudicial murders that have occurred recently, that happened a year after our return from our visit to Montgomery. One of the great things of this trip was getting to know our fellow travelers, and the man on the far right in this photograph, the handsome young man with his back to us, is Van Gilmer in the early 1960s in Greensboro, North Carolina, in a Woolworths at one of the legendary lunch counter protests. And I have to say his life experience is far different than mine as a white man. But I'm very grateful for both Van and all the black travelers that went on our trip, because all of their experiences we started to share and got to understand each other, and it was truly one of the most transformative parts of the experience. So you'll see in this next slide, now I'll let Van read his quote himself, but this is just a photograph at the end of an evening where a group of us, including Carl, who's on the call tonight, were able to sit around and discuss what we'd experienced. As you can imagine, these were deeply emotional days. And although I didn't fully understand this at the time, this was as important a part of the trip as anything else, was getting to actually have open and honest conversations about race. And I wouldn't really come to appreciate how important that was for a long, long time after we returned back to our lives here. But I'll let Van go ahead and read here.
After all of these years dealing and thinking about racism and its effect on me and so many other African Americans, I hadn't really thought about going to Montgomery, Alabama. I've lived through so much just growing up in America that I had nearly reached the point where I was thinking that we are getting worse instead of better, though many old Jim Crow laws have been changed. Then at the last minute, I decided to join a group of white people from the Wilmette area who had already decided to go to Montgomery. I wondered what makes them want to go, and why do I have so many reservations about seeing this history? Surely I was already educated. And then as we met each other and started to see how much all of us had missed in our history classes that had not been taught, for me, it was almost humiliating to think that even in my black community, we all have gone through a lifetime of learning a series of lies and well-kept secrets. I felt that this strongly attributed to our almost immediate bonding as our group realized just how bad slavery was and racism is today.
Thanks, man. So I want to go through the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, give you a brief overview. As we mentioned, this is to commemorate the victims of racial terror lynching from 1870 to 1950. There were 4,400 documented cases that are commemorated here. And this is a powerful, powerful exhibit. It's a 6-acre site, and this is just a portion of it, but this is the main attraction. You come and as you move through, you encounter these tablets. Each of these metal tablets represents a county in the United States. And there were 800 counties where people were murdered through the form of lynching, and it documents each of those cases by showing the names and the dates that they were killed. And as you move through the museum, it begins, the tablets are resting on the floor and appear to be holding up the ceiling. But as you move through, you start to see that the tablets appear, the floor drops down and tablets kind of lift away here. And you can see it's a powerful metaphor for the experience of lynching. So the trip was a unique opportunity to learn firsthand about the history of the Deep South, of its brutal, painful history, to exploring and exposing preconceived notions about the grievous, slow-healing wounds which people of African descent in this country carry, rooted in the multi-generational experiences of chattel slavery, virulent state-sanctioned racial discrimination, and domestic terrorism for over 400 years. That's by Montgomery traveler Cynthia Barnes Slater, a black woman who's now moved out to California, but very much in touch with us still. This is kind of towards the end of the passage through the exhibit. And this was my quote. After visiting Montgomery with this group, I felt I needed to recalibrate everything I knew about history. One of my biggest realizations was that there is no such thing as a Negro problem. We have a white problem. White privilege and the myth of racial superiority is everywhere. There is a saying that fish discover water last. As white people, we are swimming in an ocean of privilege that we no longer notice. I now feel a responsibility on awakening to this fact to wake up as many other white people as possible. So, beyond the first call, which was, I would say that this itself, the call to activism, there was first the learning, the education, the experience of what we had to learn. And second was the feeling of responsibility. Now that you have this knowledge, we have to do something about it. And that Montgomery trip produced a lot of activists. And then the next most important thing I would say was that, and this took longer to happen, but was again this bonding of this friendship, that the bonds began in Montgomery but have continued to grow after we left. So this is at the Dexter Avenue Church. This is Wanda, who is a force of nature and was our guide. And this is just, I think we went upstairs to visit with some of the choir. So this is kind of a mix of both travelers and some of the people that are at the church. We also encountered Eric Garcetti, the mayor of Los Angeles, who was visiting with his family and just happened to join our tour of the Rosa Parks Museum, and then coincidentally ended up going to the Dexter Avenue Church at the same time that we did. So we were very encouraged to see him participating in this journey. And again, this is Cynthia on the left, and Sue Engel, right? And that's just a lovely moment of friendship here. And after we left, the friendship continues. This is the upper picture is a meeting at my house at my home and Lauren's home in December of 2019. They had kind of a holiday gathering. And here, another picture is just a couple of weeks ago at Lori Goldstein's home in Wilmette, a group of travelers. This we're all kind of coming out of the pandemic here. So as I mentioned, we kind of continued into activism. This is within a week of the George Floyd murder. This was at New Trier High School, and then we kind of walked over to the village, Winnetka Village Square, Village Green, mm-hmm. Yeah. And again, just to me, this was the most important part of the trip of all the parts, was that I began to have friendships with my fellow travelers, particularly my friend Van here. And I have to say, and it took a while to really appreciate this, but I don't think it's possible to have a friendship with a person of color if you cannot have an open and honest conversation about race. If you can't do that, you're never going to have a real friendship. And let me just go on and kind of close out my part of this here and just say that there were two books that Sherry and Lori had us all read that were very helpful. Certainly the Just Mercy book by Brian Stevenson, and all the white members of the group were asked to read the book White Fragility. And we'll put this slide up again later if you need it, but we hope that you will stay in touch. If you look for further information, RAIN, Racial Awareness in the North Shore, is a group that you can learn about the topic of race and what you can do about improving social justice. I wish I had put HEROES on this slide, because for many of you, HEROES is another great group, and I'm sure that Audrey can put you in touch with HEROES. TIBA, which is in the more of the southwest suburbs, but it's another group that Together is Better Alliance, Pizza and Social Justice. And last, if you are interested, we are starting to plan more trips to Montgomery in the future. And if you wish to be in touch about being added to a list, please send an email to me, Bruce at Bondi Studio, or to Lori Goldstein at lauragold@gmail.com. So with that, I'm going to turn over to my dear friend June Furlan, and I'm going to end my slideshow, and I will let June take it from here. Stop share. Okay.
Thank you, Bruce. So, good evening, everyone. I want to do 4 things today. First, I want to introduce myself and tell you why I went to Montgomery. Second, I want to share with you what I learned in Montgomery. Third, I want to share a family story related not to Montgomery, but to racism. Fourth, I want to tell how this trip has changed my perspective. So, my name is June Furlan. I am Black. I'm a daughter of the Deep South. I grew up in New Orleans, Louisiana during the Civil Rights era. So I've experienced Jim Crow and segregation and lived through much of the hard work to dismantle these things. So, a little bit more about me. So growing up in New Orleans, the community was large. So I think the difference between New Orleans and Montgomery is a question of scale. We both had our Black institutions and our culture, but I think the scale meant that there there was more insulation against racial terrorism in New Orleans. We had it, but it was more insulated. So I was completely ignorant about terrorism, especially in a small rural town. For most of my working life, I've structured new derivative products for trading. So I'm familiar with markets, and I've worked with a lot of different products, from precious metals and currencies to credit default swaps. So I understand, my understanding of markets, I can envision how a slave market works and how you would derive a price for a slave. You know, I'm not proud of it, but it's part of my work experience. But more importantly, in the 90s, I was chief economist for the New York Cotton Exchange, which meant I have a little bit of understanding of the driver of the demand for slaves. And I understand the collateral, the financing of the slave trade, and so forth. So one day I get this phone call from my girlfriend, Cynthia, about this group trip to Montgomery, Alabama, with some people from the North Shore. Now, friends, I grew up thinking that Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana were the most racist and backward states. I had to go back home to Louisiana to visit my family, but why would I ever want to go to Montgomery, Alabama? But I did go, and here's why. One, Cynthia was Black, and I knew I would be the only Black person in this group. Two, Sherry and Lori had done all the planning, and they did a great job of the planning. So I could be a free rider. I could take advantage of what they had planned. And before the trip, as Bruce has said, Sherry and Lori had icebreakers so that we could meet and prep for the trip. We had a group of 27 people, and they weren't all white. So they were diverse, they were international. The white Americans agreed not to take refuge in their whiteness. We could continue and discuss these things during the trip and after the trip. This was going to be an interactive journey with bright people who wanted to and were prepared to talk about race. The third reason I went was personal. The Southern Poverty Law Center and the Equal Justice Initiatives were in Montgomery. My husband is an armchair historian, and he would just moderate, in the 80s and 90s, he would moderate groups online that discussed Civil War reconstruction, and he would interview historians, and they would talk about race, and he was there to make sure, to moderate and make sure that it was all kept friendly. Well, there were a group of white supremacists from Washington State who were angry about his moderation, and they filed lawsuits demanding all our assets. But we went to the Southern Poverty Law Center, and they came to our aid and didn't charge us anything, but they filed countersuits to these supremacists. So I knew that there were institutions that were active in Montgomery and that responded and would help people. So that's the last reason I went to Montgomery. Was I felt a need to talk about race. We had made a lot of progress in the 60s, but something wasn't right. Certainly things have improved, but there was no more Jim Crow. I could go to college, I could go to an integrated school, I could work on Wall Street, we could elect a Black president, but there was still something wrong. There was Katrina, there was Charleston, there was Michael Brown, Sandra Bland, and a host, George Floyd. A lot of people had been killed, and it wasn't, and we needed to talk about this, where we are now. So I think Montgomery is a strange place, quite honestly. It seems frozen in time, like it's a throwback to the pre-Civil War era. You don't have institutionalized slavery, but you have many of the elements. It's a place where the past, present, and future collide. Many chapters in American history have taken place in Montgomery, many from slavery, Civil War, Jim Crow, and the Civil Rights Movement. You can, it's vital to the present also. You can look at the systemic impact of racism through the work of the Equal Justice Initiative and the Southern Poverty Law Center. It's a future that's being led by a diverse international group of people leading the way to racial justice in Montgomery. And they're not leaving the rest of us behind. They're slowly dragging us with them, with their activism. They're educating us. So let's talk about the trip a little bit. Have you ever heard or learned something so astonishing that you just had to sit down and think about it? Maybe it's something you should have known. Maybe it's something you never ever thought of. Well, I call these sit-down moments. I had a few sit-down moments in Montgomery, and I'll share 3 of them with you. So my first sit-down moment, my friend Cynthia and I arrived in Montgomery a day ahead of the group scheduled meetup. This is a chance to do stuff not on the proposed agenda. So Montgomery is a state capital, so we decided to go see the state capital. And the state capital is on a hilltop that overlooks downtown Montgomery. It's this huge Greek Revival building, and there are marble steps that lead up to this grand entrance. Oh, something else. Montgomery is the first capital of the Confederacy. So you can stand, as you go up these steps, you can stand on the spot where Jefferson Davis was sworn in as president of the Confederacy in 1861. You can see chambers where the Southern states met. There are a lot of tourism groups, tour groups of the Confederacy that are interested in Jefferson Davis. It's kind of creepy, actually. So there's a saying that everything is bigger in Texas. Well, it seems that in Alabama celebrates the Confederacy Texan style. At the top of the hill outside the Capitol, there is a statue of a Confederate soldier that is a football field tall, 88 feet. At the bottom of the statue, they say, this monument represents patriotism. So this was my first sit-down moment. Cynthia grew up in San Francisco, not the Deep South. Her reaction was, these people were rebels, they were insurgents, and they lost the war. What other country in the world could you put up statues that honored traitors who shot your country's soldiers? Does Germany have statues that honor Hitler and Nazis? Not Germany, but we do. I felt that it was a nightmare that I just wanted to escape from. And so I decided that, June, you can't run away from this. Shoulders back, walk slowly. They say that the South lost the war but won the peace. And this was evidence of the South controlling the narrative of the Civil War. So how much progress had Alabama really made? How much because it was the capital and the capital of the Confederacy, did Montgomery live in a different reality? Those are questions I had. So, but I knew that few problems have been solved by ignoring them or making stuff up, as Brian Stevenson says. The South had done exactly stuff. They made stuff up. They ignored what they didn't want to see. Brian Stevenson says, you do not ball up in a corner with guilt and shame. You do not forbid any mention of the issues. In fact, you do the opposite. You educate yourself. We are heirs to this country and to whatever is right or wrong with it. That was my first sit-down moment. So my second sit-down moment was when we visited the Legacy Museum. So I just have to mention that there are quite a few civil rights museums that are in this country. And usually the emphasis is on a timeline, what problems we faced and what we did to eliminate, say, Jim Crow. So from oppression to civil rights reform. And so it's a narrative that's linear and straightforward. But the Legacy Museum is different. It focuses on how racism became systemic. What's the impact of slavery? What's the impact of racial segregation? What's the impact of lynching on us? So there are issues that we cannot face today unless we really understand those impacts. So as we entered the Legacy Museum, I noticed on the wall that it says, you are standing on the site where enslaved people were warehoused. This is my second sit-down moment. When it became illegal to import slaves from abroad, the domestic market for slaves grew. And Montgomery, because of cotton, became the largest slave trading center. And the area between the Alabama River and our hotel were filled with warehouses that held enslaved people waiting to be sold. They walked from Virginia and North Carolina. They came by steamboat, by rail from the Upper South to Montgomery to be warehoused and sold. And the museum did a very good job of portraying these slave narratives and making you understand the human misery that was involved. So it so happened that a few months prior to our trip, I had gone to the Holocaust Museum and saw Purchased Lives, the American slave trade from 1808 to 1865. And on the section of the domestic slave trade, there was, New Orleans was a primary slave trading center, and the largest slave market in New Orleans was at the St. Louis Hotel. There was a map showing the location of this hotel, and I looked at it, and to my horror, I realized that this is the place I held my wedding reception, that I had held it on hallowed ground, and I had no idea about the importance of that building. So in Montgomery, there are over 50 Confederate monuments, and there are only 2 markers identifying the slave trading markets. In New Orleans, we didn't even put a marker out. The marker was actually at the bar across the street from the hotel. Too often our history is lost because no one tells the story associated with a structure, a building, an event. This is changing, but this is my second sit-down moment. My third sit-down moment was on a visit to the National National Memorial for Peace and Justice. Bruce has shown you all the pictures, so I won't go through that. But for each county, there's a list of people who were lynched in that county. And ladies and gentlemen, when you see a name, you start thinking of this not as a statistic, but as a human being who died. And the memorial, as Bruce says, is very powerful. It means that each of those deaths were not in vain. The monument tells their stories and their truths to everyone in the world. And these were deaths meant to control and terrorize Black Americans into submission. And while I was there, I mean, it's so much to process. I said to one of the guides, all the guides are very well trained. I said, take me to the worst case. And by worse, I meant a county that had many deaths. He took me to a place called Phillips County, Arkansas. There's a city called Elaine, Arkansas there. And that tablet, there were too many names to put into 2 columns. So I wanted to know the story of Phillips County, Arkansas. And the Times, the New York Times and other newspapers have done recent stories on Elaine, Arkansas. But it's possibly the bloodiest racial conflict in the history of the US, where close to 1,000 people died in 1 week. Children, babies, everyone died because of the farmers there trying to unionize. So I encourage you to read, just look up in the New York Times. So the last thing I'm going to do is share a family story. Now, my family does not share its stories, but I have to thank my cousin, one of my cousins, who kept the story alive by telling it whenever he could, because he loved the story. And I have to thank his daughter, who's a librarian in Homewood, who tells the story all the time, and she tells it much better than I. So I'm going to take you back to the early days of New Orleans, the early 1900s, where my family says that when it rained, the wooden sidewalks in New Orleans floated away, after a heavy rain. But my grandfather, Jesse, who was 14, worked for the sawmills in Harvey, Louisiana. The workers in the sawmills and truck farms lived in what's called company housing. I should tell you that company housing means plantation. My grandpa worked with Black people and with Italians. This was a time when Italians weren't considered white yet, because many of the immigrants from Southern Italy had dark complexions. He became particularly good friends with a boy named Carlos. They were 14-year-old boys. I don't understand what they did, but they enjoyed each other. And they became really good friends. But the 2 boys went off in 2 different completely directions. Carlos joined the New Orleans Mafia, and he eventually became the head of the New Orleans Mafia. That's right, Carlos Marcellus. Jesse married and had 9 children. Jesse and Carlos were in different worlds, but Jesse was family to Carlos. Family legend says that Carlos sent a gift for each birthday because they're Jesse's kids. Okay, so Carlos Marcellus, some of you may have heard of him, some of you may not. He was the head of the New Orleans Mafia. He was called before Senate committees on organized crime, not once but twice, where he pled the fifth 150 times. So in 1963, JFK is assassinated. Carlos Marcellus had the means, the motives, and connections to Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby to be deeply involved in the assassinations. There are countless investigations on his involvement in this assassination. But Jesse raised his kids to fight suppression within the system. His son Lionel became the first Black lawyer in Jefferson Parish, which is right next to the city of New Orleans. He was a second-generation civil rights lawyer. By that I mean he was one of the lawyers who implemented the Brown versus Board of Education decision. He was part of the Dandridge desegregation case, one of the first cases to force the integration of New Orleans public schools. Well, enter the Ku Klux Klan. They sent death threats to everyone on the Dandridge desegregation team. They sent letters to their homes filled with vile words. They took the letters to the police. Of course, the police says, oh, we can't help you. Probably the police were the same men sending the threats. So one day, the KKK is planning to take care of this problem, this desegregation problem. But the mafia knows everything, and we all know how the mafia feels about family. The story goes that Carlos was sitting at the table at Marcellus transaction business when he heard about the KKK plans on a lawyer named Lionel Collins. He said, Collins, find out if this is Jesse's boy. And they found out it was indeed Jesse's boy. And the story says that Carlos bent over the table and wrote a letter that had his official signature. He had it sent to the Grand Wizard of the KKK. There was one sentence on that letter. These death threats against Lionel Collins will stop. Signed, Carlos Marcellus. And indeed, the death threats did stop. Carlos Marcellus is a villain to many people, but sometimes the bad guys aren't always bad, and sometimes they're heroes. So when I looked at the tablet for Orleans and Jefferson Parish, Louisiana, I was very thankful that the name Lionel R. Collins was not there. But I can also tell you, you should not need the protection of the mafia to keep your name off the wall. So we're living history at this moment. We're having conversations about race that I never ever thought we would have. In fact, I once said to my husband that I thought we were hitting our head against the wall, hoping for change when things were getting, as the old folks say, worse and worse. I had concluded my generation was just in the way and we needed to die. I hope that younger generations would be able to solve this racial problems after we die. But I'm feeling hopeful. I'm impressed with what the younger generation is doing. And I feel that we may, in our lifetimes, see some differences. It's because our trip to Montgomery and our discussions about race, I have hope. I may not like where we are as a country, but this is where we are at this point in time, and we'll take it from there. So I'm handing it off to Sherry right now. Sherry, are you there?
Okay, June, thank you so much. I always appreciate your insights and in particular sit-down moments. Even though I've heard you speak about this so many times, you still touch me in such a deep way. And thank you, dear friend. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about how the trip to Montgomery evolved. So my dear friend Lori Goldstein had taken a trip. She had co-facilitated a trip with her synagogue, and they took 30 people to Montgomery. And she and her husband were telling my husband and I about it, and we just said, okay, just give us the agenda because we're going. And then this idea evolved that rather than just going with my husband, that Lori and I would commit to planning a trip, which would include, many people, up to 30. So that's how it all started. Now, initially, although we had invited 3 Black friends, none of whom were able to come, the trip was looking very kind of North Shore, mostly white. There were some people of color involved. And then Lori had the opportunity to work with a racial justice group that included Van and Cynthia. And she was telling them about our plans. And Cynthia indicated she wanted to go. And then Van was convinced to go. And of course, June and Hugh, his sister. So then our group became very interfaith. We had Muslims, Jewish people, Christians, Baha'i, Hindu, and different ethnicities, people, as someone mentioned, from different countries and different colors. So the planning took on a little bit of a different flavor because we wanted to ensure that everyone was very comfortable. So we had that in mind. We had a pre-meeting where the intention was definitely ice-breaking, but also we established collectively as a group the guidelines for communication during our trip. And so that was kind of the first concrete step. Then we had asked people of different faiths to prepare a reading, which they would share in Montgomery. So we had about 5 or 6 different readings from various faiths. And we also had a group gathering after the Legacy Museum, and it was very introspective. We reflected on the Legacy Museum, and we worked in small groups and the larger group. And for me, that was, and I think for most people, that was such an incredible experience because it was the first time that we really had an opportunity in Montgomery to discuss, the beginning of the trip, which was the Legacy Museum, and people shared so much during that time. So there were many, many opportunities. We organized dinners in various ways and such. So following our trip, we had a post meeting, and it was also to regroup and reflect on our visit and also discuss ways we might work on racial justice. So people were sharing what they were doing, what they might want to do. And then, as Bruce said, since then, our connection just continues. It gets stronger. It hasn't wavered. We are committed to one another. There's a deep love and respect for one another. So it really was a very life-changing and wonderful experience. And I wanted to mention that in the list of resources, which will be sent out by email by your church next week, I believe, Audrey, my email address will be there. And if anyone is inclined to plan their own trip and they want our resources, our templates, just contact me by email and we'll be glad to share that. Okay, so now on to my experience in Montgomery. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but it was an experience, a weekend of education, understanding, and growth for me. And the entire weekend was so powerful. I experienced a lot of varied and very intense emotions during that time. And I wanted to also talk about the Legacy Museum because it's one of the two experiences I'm going to focus on for my talk. But we met for the first time on a Thursday night, and then the following morning on Friday, we toured the Legacy Museum. And I have to tell you, the act of entering this former warehouse, now the Legacy Museum, where African people were sold, were brutalized, humanized, and where family separation happened, was just a feeling I'll never forget. You know how you have those moments you know will stay with you? That will always stay with me. And I want it to, because I feel that's a part of my humanity. And as I walked through the doors, I had a deep visceral reaction to the first exhibit I saw. It was an HBO video of a family of three, mother, father, and young girl sleeping. And suddenly there was loud banging, there were brutal noises and terrorizing shouting going on, awakening them. And the fear that they experienced was so realistic as they were awoken from their sleep. And their pain was so evident. They were crying, the little girl was screaming in terror, and they were separated. And the brutality of it all was just so intense. They were moved from the house they shared, and they were separated. And it was somehow communicated in that video that they had been expecting this. They had lived with this fear that their family was going to be separated. So the word that was ingrained in my head watching this, it was flashing in my brain, was inhumanity. The other word was greed. But I have to tell you, this video, which was very upsetting, set the tone for the museum, because the Legacy Museum does not hold back. As June described, they tell the story like it is. I became a witness to this brutality and the impact of enslavement through the powerful dramatizations, visuals, and the holographic first-person accounts, as well as, you know, other hands-on things like the soil from lynching areas. It was stunning. I felt angry, I felt sad, and I felt sickened. And I still do when I think about it. So I slowly and respectively, very quietly walked through the Legacy Museum in silence. And, you know, we knew many of the people there. They were on our trip, and there was no discussion. We would just look at each other. There were no words. But that Legacy Museum is a place of truth. It is sacred. So the second thing I wanted to mention is my second remembrance of our last evening together. And it was powerful also. It was positive, it was joyful, affirming, and absolutely amazing. But first, let me just explain again that our trip culminated in this evening because of the interactions during the 2 days. So during our time together, we began from a respectful yet somewhat tentative icebreaker 2 weeks before we left, and also the evening we all arrived. Things were tentative. People were, warming up, but we hadn't reached the pinnacle, which happened on Saturday. So the next 2 days provided many opportunities for connection. Besides the group site visits and planned activities in small and large groups, people were walking from one event to another, meeting in the hotel, breakfast room, or in the lobby, exchanging words, talking about our experience. We're maybe grabbing lunch together. And sometimes, thanks to our beautiful Baha'i choral people, we broke out in song. And that was really fun too. So there's a lot of connection. And we were pretty much together all our waking hours. I feel our growing bonds were natural outcomes of this intense and shared hour-by-hour experience. So our final evening began in a private room at the iconic Montgomery Southern eatery called Martha's Place. And I have to say, Martha's Place is a must-do or a must-eat when you go to Montgomery. For dinner, we had an enthusiastic guest speaker. You saw a picture of her earlier, and her name's Wanda. And Bruce called her a force of nature, and he's right. She rocked our group with stories and her history in Civil Rights Montgomery. And she led us in song. Our vibe was positive. We all eased into a really nice place of comfort with one another. And after dinner, people were moving from table to table, chatting, laughing. And then our beloved Van stood up and gave his personal reflections on the weekend. And all I want to say is, wow. And thank you, Van, for leading the way to deepening the conversation that followed. I think Van also sang. He probably did. So things were happening from a tentative first evening when most were meeting for the first or second time. People were trusting one another now. Friendships were evolving as we reached out, sharing our reflections, reactions, and personal experiences. And later that evening, after the restaurant, we congregated in the hotel lobby to continue our conversations. It seemed to go on a long time, well into the night, and there was a lot of laughter. It was a very beautiful experience. And one thing Bruce didn't mention, but it's a quote I love, and it's a Bruce quote. And he often says, going to Montgomery is like falling in love with 27 people simultaneously. And I think that is a good description of what was happening. So it was really an incredible night where so much came together for us. And just to conclude about Montgomery, it was in the middle of this milieu of shared discovery and emotion where I was able to hear the personal stories and histories of our Black, our African American, people of color, fellow travelers, stories I really had no idea about. So that was a gift. Where I will be forever grateful for the openness, the generosity, trust, and vulnerability established in Montgomery. Where we began to grow together in understanding and compassion, and where the seeds of true friendship were planted. Where we began to make commitments to support one another and work together towards racial justice. And where in a short and intense and loving weekend, the Montgomery travelers have become deeply rooted in my heart. And now I'm pleased to introduce my dear friend, Hugh Semple.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted. Yes, I am. Thank you, Sherry, very much. It's great to hear her story again. And I wanted to say thank you to Pastor Mark for inviting us to be with you folks tonight. And I'm so grateful that you folks turned out, because this is something that's very meaningful to all of us among the Montgomery travelers. This was a remarkable experience. And for me, it was life-changing. And I wanted to share with you that let me start with, I am my spiritual belief and practice is the Baha'i faith. And what I see and what I have learned from my faith, we put a lot of emphasis on the importance of race unity and social justice. And so what I wanted to share is that it's very critical. This is the most vital and challenging issue that we're facing, humanity is facing today. And we believe that it is possible for the entire world to be unified with unity and diversity around the world. All countries, all people, all ethnic groups, etc. And it's for our own future existence. If we in America can resolve this issue, this scourge of racism, I believe it will assure peace in the rest of the world. And I believe that most people are attracted to the light of informed, caring, compassion, empathy, and justice that equals coherent, unified spirit of community. So we agreed, my compatriots in the Montgomery Travelers, we agreed to accompany one another on this trip in the spirit of accepting each other's experience and condition with love and compassion, providing the presence of emotional safety for all to process what each needed for their own spiritual and historical growth. In the process, I witnessed my own humanity and the deep humanity of my 27 other companions. Each one of us had the courage to take this journey of exploration, sharing our thoughts, wounds, and fears, not knowing what to expect. We realized a deep commitment to the continuation of our friendship, building bonds, furthering each other's efforts for social and racial justice. I learned that I could trust each soul and their intentions. It was healing for me. It gave me hope. I know that each one of them are my go-to people when I'm discouraged or struggling with this burden of racism. We have an ongoing dialogue that bears the fruit of each other's dignity and endeavors for justice and peace. We all came alive with mutual aid and reciprocity in our journey. I identify myself as African American because my humanity is, I'm an African with an American experience, thus African American. Something that is very important to me is my culture. I am very proud of the culture that I come from. I'm very proud of my family. I'm very proud of the achievements that my family have made. And I understand their struggles that they are challenged with. And so what I would like to, the question out of all of this that I would like to ask folks to consider is, can you stay in the room? Can I stay in the room? Put it in the personal. Can I stay in the room to have and learn how to have a meaningful conversation about race. Because until we start doing that, until we learn to have true consultation, true conversation, meaningful understandings, it's going to be very difficult for us in this country to make progress. And the longer it takes, the more danger we will face. I think that I will keep it short. I've said the essence of what I've needed to say. And so I will introduce you to Van Gilmore, who is a very, I have a lot of appreciation and admiration for Van, for the work he has done in the past and for the work that he does now for racial justice. And he's an inspiration to me, and everyone in the group is an inspiration to me. I have seen how I have grown. There is something, speaking of how I have grown, there is something that I would like to share with you that I haven't said yet, and that is a quote from Frederick Douglass. Excuse me, Van, I won't be long. A quote from Frederick Douglass is, "No man can put a chain about the ankle of his fellow man without at last finding the other end fastened about his own neck." I'd like to read it again. "No man can put a chain about the ankle of his fellow man without at last finding the other end fastened about his own neck." The personal advisor of Dr. Martin Luther King, his name is Howard Thurman. He lived from 1899 to 1981. And Howard Thurman said something that's very profound to me, very similar in spirit to what Frederick Douglass said. But he says it in a way that I think is very unique to and needed to be heard, which is, our communities cannot feed for long on itself. It can only flourish where always the boundaries are giving way to the coming of others from beyond them. Unknown and undiscovered brothers, for this is why we were born. People, all people, belong to each other, and he who shuts himself away diminishes himself. And he who shuts another away from him destroys himself. So that's the reason why I'm saying we're facing a challenge that truly needs to be faced, and we have to do it together, and we have to do it with full sincerity. I have to do it and be honest, hold myself accountable and be honest. And I would hope the same would come from my other fellows, my other brothers and sisters. So with that, I will yield to Van, and thank you everyone for sharing this evening with me.
Well, as I read earlier to you, I hadn't thought very much about going to Montgomery. A third of my life, practically a third of my life, actually a little less than a third of my life, I lived in a Black community. I lived in segregated America. I had no thoughts that anything would change. I thought that we would always be separated. But let me tell you something all Black people have been able to do. Even when I was in a Black community, I could see white world. I could see it on TV. I could see it in movies. I could see it when we had to go out to buy groceries that was beyond what a little snack shop would have. It was not scary. It was just the way life was. As you saw earlier, I participated in the sit-ins in Greensboro, North Carolina. And that was in the early 60s. The first 4 people who went downtown and sat at the lunch counter was in 1960. And following their having done that, many of us who were in college, we were young people. We were not the old black community, which was at that time, of course, still and still is represented by the NAACP. We broke a rule. We broke a long time rule that all those times I had gone downtown with my mother, I could only pass the stools in front of the lunch counter. It's with this kind of a background that I had to think a lot about why I would go to Montgomery. Now, I had been to Montgomery several times because my son enrolled at Tuskegee University, which is a historically black college. I'll never forget my trips from Greensboro, North Carolina to Montgomery. Actually, it was to Tuskegee, and Tuskegee is just about 25 miles from Montgomery. If I flew, I had to fly into Montgomery. And when I flew into Montgomery, I was very apprehensive. I would have a rental car. I'd go get it. And I thought, you know, I've seen in the news Montgomery and the bus boycott. I should go into the city before I go on to Tuskegee. And I went into Montgomery, and it was at nighttime. And as June mentioned, it sits on a hill, and it was lighted. This like in Washington D.C., you can see the Capitol of the United States. It was, and I drove up, but it was strange to me that the streets were pretty empty. I didn't see anybody. I also knew better than to walk on those streets. And so I drove up as close as I could get to the Capitol. I got out of my car and I looked around, and I was nervous because I didn't see anybody. I was nervous because I didn't know if being out of the car would make me seem like somebody who was going to do something bad. Because, you know, the stories are, you know, black people always stealing stuff, breaking into places. I mean, that's the history that is true history to the world, but not really true history. So I got in my car and I drove on to Tuskegee. I was surprised when I arrived at the airport this time with 27 white people. I'm not 27 white people, but almost 27 white people. I had not really thought about going with them to Montgomery because I already had too much in my heart and in my experience to feel comfortable going to Montgomery, to now these museums I've been hearing about, but not sure I would go to unless I were with some black friends. So I decided to go, and as Sherry said, I was a late person to say, yes, I'll go with you. I didn't tell Lori that I had ready made a reservation at the hotel. I wanted to have that there so that if I should decide to go, I could be in the hotel with everybody else. In Montgomery, I would say to you and to anybody else, it is an experience that even if you do by yourself, and if you think about how much we have not been told, if you think about the little words that said, I'm looking for my little girl. They took her. Have you seen her? They call her, and then she was saying, and I'm reading these signs saying, oh my Lord, this is worse than being in segregated America. These are my ancestors. Why didn't I read about this? When you think about going to the monument with all these stones hanging, you saw them. And I think June, somebody, there were many names on it, and it was everybody who was lynched in a county, not a state, in a county. It was name after name after name after name after name. And you know what we know? What we all know? We all know that Emmett Till got lynched. He wasn't hung, he was just beaten. What we know is that his mother decided to leave his casket open so people could see how badly he was mutilated. This is true history. This is the history that we still keep wanting to hide. Here in the North Shore, we're talking about, let's see if we can include history as it is in the books of our children, because none of you can tell the story to them. It's not an easy story to tell. So you get your background and you get your information, and it might affect you so that your feelings will make you say, we cannot go on like this. June talked about that big tall statue. You know, there's one in almost every southern city. And black people always have to drive around it to go downtown. In Tuskegee, there's one in the middle of this little city of Tuskegee. Thomas Jefferson, indeed. Our history has not been told. And yet, even today, even yesterday, you hear people saying, this will traumatize our children. But how will we know how it feels to not just say we're no longer people that don't like each other. We're people who like each other. You see Bruce sitting here with me? We didn't plan this. He just this evening said before the thing, he said, how about I come down and we do this from your house? I said, well, sure. Are you kidding me? Yes. It wasn't an act. And many of us, black and white, have learned to act like everything is fine. But we know almost immediately, those of us who are black know almost immediately when somebody who is white means what they're doing, saying, and what they're doing. We feel it. We feel it. And so this trip to Montgomery affected me like I can't tell you, because it validated me and my family and all of us who are in this country who were formerly enslaved. And we see how the country was built. Not like we heard, not like we learned. So I think the trip to Montgomery for anybody is one that will make you stop to think, what in the world were our ancestors thinking about when they told us this beautiful story of America the Beautiful, the land of the free, the home of the brave. And we sing the song. I've been singing the song. But I just hope that any of you who are here will think about what looking at the history of America really is. You know, you can read books. You know, we've talked about virtual tour. We've got people working on virtual tours. It is not the same as seeing it. It's not the same as being there and reading the stories and looking at the little videos of some are reacting of what went on, but it's all lost. There's a great author that at least black people know, John Hope Franklin, and he had a book called Up from Slavery. I didn't see that book until I was in college. And when I read that book, I thought about us coming up from slavery. Up from slavery after having learned so many things that we'll have to unlearn. So I'm happy I went. I'm happy I went with the group I went with. I'm not sure if you could experience this with a group you go with, if you should decide to go. But I think you can make it happen. If it happens to be a group that is integrated, I think it would be a wonderful thing. I didn't, as I thought about whether I would go or not. But as all of us have said, we've become friends. We've become friends unlike what we've had. And so my encouragement is to think about how we can go. And I think some of us will go with you. Some of us will go again to just help walk you through, hoping the experience we had will be the experience that you'll have. So that's all I have to say. Are we going to you, Ellen, for questions?
We
Any
have
questions?
questions. Thank you. So feel free to add more questions. And the first one I'd like to share, Carl Slater asks, what are ways to wake up white people? What do you advise? What should a white guy do? Anybody want to jump in and answer that? What are ways to wake up white people?
Well, it's a great question, and I'm sure Carl has been answering that question since he went to Montgomery too. I know one of the things that many of us, when we returned, particularly if you're white and you live in a white community, one of the things that when I came back, the first thing, it was almost a euphoric experience in a way, but it became very important to talk about it to people. So we would share the story of our trip to Montgomery with people, and it almost became like a litmus test. You could tell the people that were sincerely interested and wanted to know more details and wanted to hear about it. And it was kind of shocking. There were sometimes people you talk about it and you could just tell they couldn't wait to move on to something else, or they would try and change the subject. Or, oh, I just went on vacation and I went golfing, so I'm like, no, you're just kind of missing the point. So it really all begins with talking about it. There's so many different ways to come into it, and I'll stop in a second. But we met someone after we went to Montgomery who had been a Trump supporter, and to our astonishment, she had come full circle and had become a race activist. And her experience was her family was talking to her. Her kids, after they learned that she'd voted in the election, they practically disowned her. And that set her on a journey. So I think that, to me, says it's important to talk to people that you're close to. If you're white, talk to people that you're close to, friends, family, where you have some degree of influence. Don't just keep this to yourself. Talk about it. And it's remarkable what change can happen. So I'll let any of the other people, if they want to share more about answering that question.
Anyone else want to jump in? We had another. Oh, Sherry, did you want to?
I would just add on to Bruce. I agree with what Bruce says. My experience talking with some white people about race has not been productive. And this is when I first came back, and I was, I just wanted to talk to everyone about race, and I really didn't have a good plan. I think it's important to kind of have your talking points, understand where you're going with the discussion, and realize that change is incremental, that suddenly you may not be able to change someone's beliefs or behaviors. But if you can have a civil and honest dialogue, then I think there's hope. So I think as a white person, I feel that I just need to keep trying and keep going with the discussion, the ongoing dialogue, and remain civil and thoughtful in my approach.
Thank you.
Let me add just one
yes,
last
please.
thing. After George Floyd's murder, my wife and I, we live in Northbrook, and which is, very much a white bubble. It's my wife teaches a workshop on. She's a parenting professional, and she teaches a workshop on how to raise white kids to to learn about racism and to learn how to be, especially when you grow up in an all-white community. And before that, the events of May and June of, because certainly George Floyd was not the only one. It was just kind of like, it seemed to have the biggest resonance. And my wife had taught this workshop and had maybe a dozen people asked to join. And the week after, she posted something in a mom's group, and 150 people sent her a message within 72 hours asking. So my point there is that people, like I say, the fish discover water last. It's like people suddenly kind of wake up that it really is a problem. And that's an important opportunity to start having conversations with people about things that are often difficult. And you know, we all have to learn to have that conversation. So.
Thank you. We have oh, Hugh, yes, please.
I would like to suggest that how to get white people or white men, was that the question? White people or white men to wake up to racism?
Yeah.
My response to that is it really is important. Rather than getting someone else to wake up, it's important for one to wake up themselves. It's really about personal transformation and wanting to find one's own sense of humanity. And as one does that, it's important to be in contact with, build relationships with, and have dialogue with people of color. And as that is done, as that process is, as that process goes on, one begins to change and for the better, and open the mind and open the heart, and people will recognize that change. And it's really about setting an example. As I change my heart, I become more attractive. I become more easy to talk to. I become non-judgmental. And I want to share my story, and I'm willing to listen to the other person and their own human experience, what their story is. And with that kind of spirit, the more people who are willing to do that kind of work come together and unify, the more attractive it becomes to other people. And it's important to understand that people of color are watching and waiting for people of faith to step up to the plate and do this work. And as folks of color see this, they're going to be more open to making that kind of connection with you or with others. And as that happens, this assumption, this attitude of this subconscious attitude of superiority that white Americans have, that their culture is superior and their way of thinking, their mindset is the superior way of thinking, it will become more clear that it's toxic to our planet, it's toxic to oneself, and it's toxic to other people. And if we're willing to, if white Americans are willing to let go of that for their own sake and for the sake of everyone prospering in this planet, because there's enough wealth and resources in this world for every human being that is on this planet. Instead of hoarding power and wealth, how about we hoard love and compassion and a love for God, our creator? I think if we can hoard that for our own soul, it will spill over to other people. And that's the work we're going to have to do. It is not going to be easy. It isn't meant to be easy. It's meant to be a challenge because that's how we grow spiritually, psychologically, emotionally, culturally. We grow. And it's about transforming the inner self.
I love that. Hoarding love. Susan Ross asked, how do white people get a true understanding of the impact of racism without placing a burden on Black people? Any thoughts?
I'd like to start.
Thank you.
There are tons of resources out there. Educate yourself, go to the library, turn on public television. There are plenty of documentaries. There are plenty of books out there. As a matter of fact, Slavery by Another Name is a good start. The re-enslavement of Black Americans from the Civil War to World War II. The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. It explains how our government and governmental policies have created a profound destruction of the African American family and generational wealth. It has destroyed opportunities. You'll understand once you read Rothstein's book and get a sense of the history of how land and property and wealth was stolen from Black folks. We don't have the statistical problems that we hear in the news because we wanted to create it. We have it because of a system that wants to keep us suppressed for giving privilege and advantage to white people. Another one I would recommend is Despite Your Best Intentions. It's about how we segregate our schools and segregate within our schools. Even if the school inside the building is integrated, we still practice segregation inside our schools. The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Color Blindness. Tremendous book. And I highly recommend for everyone, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, written by Joy DeGruy. It's a brilliant work and will give you great insight into understanding the challenge and the struggle that African Americans go through and why it has gone on for so many generations. And there are other resources. I'd be glad to share this with Pastor Mark, and maybe this could be passed on to the rest of the folks that are watching tonight.
And Hugh mentioned The Color of Law, which was written by Richard Rothstein. And I do want to just put in a little plug that on October 13th, Richard Rothstein will be speaking through 50 libraries in the Chicago area through an event that we actually helped organize. And if you, through the resources, we'll put some information about that. You can get more through either Rain, or you want to contact me through my email address. But registration, you probably will be able to register through your local library, which is probably signed up, or through the Northburg Library. But he's going to be a great speaker. He's not only going to be talking about The Color of Law, but he's going to be talking about, he's interviewed the Montgomery Travelers about the work that we're doing together. We're going to be part of his next book. He's also going to be focusing on steps to redress segregation. Reversing segregation is somewhat the topic of his next book, and a new civil rights movement.
And perhaps the hardest thing will be to begin to make friends with people of color, because you can read a whole lot, you can look at a whole lot of movies, you can come to a lot of rallies, but if you go away from that and you don't do anything more, that's not going to be it. And see, what we've been talking about is a relationship that was built when we went to Montgomery, that didn't just start with us flying down, going through the museums, and then flying back. It was, as you heard, we got together and we started getting to know each other. We started talking about what we were going to see. We started learning to know who each other was. We didn't even eat together as a big group until one time. We were told, find a place that you're going to go with 5 other people. You pick them out And so we were eating with different people all the time when we were there. There were a lot of things that were done that were trying to get us to come together. Now, you can read about what we need to do, but putting that in action is a more difficult thing. That is beginning to know somebody. If in your circle is nobody black, if you're white, then try to see if you can begin to know somebody who is. Because it's going to really ultimately take those friendships. And when we talk about love, you can't love until you begin to know each other.
Amen.
Thank you. So we have one last question, and I wanted to mention one thing that I thought of, with Susan's question asking, how do you get a true understanding of the impact of racism without placing a burden on Black people? And perhaps this is a resource that can be shared also, Audrey, is that Van has a discussion group on the third Wednesdays. It's conversations on racism. And Van, what's the name of it? I'm sorry.
Called Intimate Dialogue on Race, preceded by various Holy Scriptures.
Yes.
So we start with reading something from the holy words of whatever religion we can use for that. And it's not just one. Mm-hmm. But then we have an intimate conversation about some of the things that happen. We ask Black people to answer some questions. We ask white people to answer some questions. Mm-hmm. Some of you have been to it. But usually it's a story that nobody's heard. It could be even your friend, your good friend, and answering the questions, and you've never heard anything about what that person is talking about. And we don't have a lot of personal conversations.
Right.
Just general conversations.
Right.
Kind of sweet sounding conversations. But personal conversations are what begin to let us know that we can be friends. I sure wouldn't have known I was going to be this man's friend. But we are friends. I mean, we're good friends. Yeah. So.
And that's what I think is so powerful about Van's group is that you're hearing personal stories from people of color and people, white people as well, but the stories of people of color that, like he said, sometimes these people already, but you never heard these kind of things, had no idea that they had been gone through these struggles, clear examples of racism. So the last question, and we're gonna get out of here by 9. This is Mark Kearns asked, and this could be a long answer, but we won't go into it too much. Mark Kearns asked this question. I don't think I've heard the word evil mentioned tonight. How important is it for that word to be part of the interracial conversation, especially for people who are religious? Does anybody want to jump in on that? I don't think I've heard the word evil mentioned tonight. How important is it for that word to be part of the interracial conversation, especially for people who are religious? Anybody want to take that on?
Well, I think that any of us who are of color, if we were to use that word, you would not be our friend. If we were to talk about how bad white people are, we'd never be able to come together. So I think we need to think on the positive side. There are plenty of words we can say that describe what we have felt all of these years, but we're trying to go up, not down. We're trying to bring the level of understanding of who we are up. And all I have to do is start acting like you're the devil, and you won't begin to hear me. So trying to figure out how to do that is not all that easy, particularly when you see what reality is. But that's, I think, what all of us who are here, we wouldn't be here talking to you about it. Because we would be saying it in a different way. We say, you all just better go on down there because But that's not the approach.
I think once you start learning history, it's pretty consistent. The evil is going to become a consistent part of it because that's what you see over and over again. And I don't think it's necessary for that, if you're black, to throw that in somebody's face, because if you start to learn history, it's you can't miss it. It's right there. Okay, but it's an interesting way of phrasing the question. So I do want to leave time for our closing portion of this. I'll say one last quick thing here, because I think they were looking for something you can do, an action you can take. And my best advice to people is begin with learning. If you want to build toward friendship, begin by learning. There's an awakening. Then the next part is kind of get into the stream of activism. Start to participate in things. I guarantee you will begin to meet people of color. Once you meet people of color, once you're able to have an open dialogue, you learn how to listen, you learn how to talk about race in an open way, and you're kind of in that stream. I guarantee you friendship will just form naturally. That will come out of it, okay? And that's the most important part of this in all, because so much of society's effort has been to keep us apart. And I believe this is the way we begin to come together and really begin to heal. Is it when you friendship is a magical thing, as it is. You know, you never know who you're going to become friends with. But once you can create the place where that magic can unfold and happen, and I think for between across the racial line, it requires people to have that open conversation.
All right.
I'm going to stop talking. Dan, something's talking to him.
Okay, now we're going to hear from Mr. Van Gilmer. Take it away, Van.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I'll unmute myself. A little too close to me.
Too close.
O thou compassionate Lord, thou who art generous and able, we are servants of thine, sheltered beneath thy providence. Cast thy glance of favor upon us, give light to our eyes, give hearing to our ears, and understanding and love to our hearts. O thou compassionate Lord, thou who art generous and able, upon us. Give light to our eyes. Give hearing to our ears, and understanding and love to our hearts. Understanding and love. Understanding and love. Understanding and love. And understanding and love to all, to all, to our hearts, to our hearts.
Amen. Thank you very much. I want to say thanks to all 5 of our presenters tonight for sharing about your journey, your pilgrimage, your spiritual journey. I think you've taken us all at least another step on our own journeys, and so we've been blessed by your presence and your sharings and those sit-down moments, and we've entered into with you. And so I know I'm a little farther along on my journey and plan to continue as well. So again, thank you all as well to Ellen Price, Audrey Moy, and Michael Kloster for helping with some of the details around this presenting part too. And so again, it's been a real blessed evening. And some of those stories are hard too. And you just shared from your hearts. And so that was so much thankful for that. So blessings to all as you go on your way this evening, and continue on your respective journey. God's peace. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What a blessing.
Thank you very much, Audrey.
Thank you. Thank you, Audrey.
Pastor.
Good work, Audrey.
Sharing.
Hi, Audrey.
Thank you, Audrey.
Thank you,
Hi,
Audrey.
Melody.
Thank you, Pastor Mark.
All of you are
Beautiful
great.
presentation.
Thank
Thank
you
you
all.
for sharing.
Well, all. Blessings.
Thanks
We're
for all
ending
those.
right on time.
Thank you.
Blessings to all.
Hey, Martha and Sue and Carl.
Fun.
Good to see you.
Thanks,
Bye.
Annie.
Jerry.
Thank you, Audrey.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for that book list.
Yes.
Thanks, Melody.
Oh, hey, Melody.
And
Thanks, Soror. Thank you, Cheryl.
thank you.
I put the link
Carol,
in.
yes.
I added the link for Van's.
The box.
Yeah, we'll add that to the resource too.
Yeah.
Ellen. I think we got to compile some of that stuff for resource here.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Audrey.
Carl and Sue. I'm just saying hi, Mark. Sarah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you,
I
Sarah.
wrote down all of Hugh's book suggestions too. We'll add those to the resource.
And thank you, Michael.
Bye, everybody.
Right.
Bye.
Thanks, Ellen.
Oh, can somebody send me that link also via email?
Yeah, we'll send it out with an email that goes out to every
Yeah,
participant.
you'll get everything about next week. We'll
Okay.
put it all together. Thank you, guys. Thank you,
This was
Jerry.
great.
What you got in?
Thank you for organizing, Audrey.
thank you.
This was
All right.
great.
Thank you, Ellen.
Good job.
Here
This
it
was
goes.
Thank
excellent.
you.
Terry, Hugh, June. Is June
Where's
there?
June?
I don't-
June.
I think she might have left. We just tell her a special thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, Auntie Elsa.
Bye.
I'll call you
You gotta
later.
stop getting together like this. We gotta do it in
Too often on
Get
Zoom.
rid of the box.
Forward.
Bye.